Hey, welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and today I'm going to be responding to a video entitled Debunking the Tag Argument for God, a compilation. Now, the video is about 23 minutes long. I think it says 23 minutes and 59 seconds. I'm not going to be going through the whole thing, but there are some interesting things. I kind of just gave it a quick look, and I want to be able to share my thoughts here. And let's see if the transcendental argument for the existence of God has been debunked. Now, of course, this is a old video. I've been looking through some interesting old videos. If you have any newer videos that you think successfully debunks tag, I'd be more than happy to give it a look. Remember, if you send me material, I would like to respond to kind of shorter content. I don't have the time to do like an in-depth response to like an hour-long discussion or debate. I wish I did. But obviously I keep reminding folks, I don't do this full time. It's actually, I'm recording right now on Sunday. So I went to church this morning and I'm here in my office at my home. It's Super Bowl Sunday, which I'm not a huge fan of football, but sorry. Hopefully I won't lose subscribers for saying that, but here I am. I'm recording and responding to some things that I find interesting and that might be useful for folks. But if you have a specific video or a specific argument you'd like me to respond to, send it over to me. If it's like a 20-minute clip, 15-minute clip, something like that, where I can do like a compilation, that'd be a little bit easier for me in terms of managing the sorts of things that I can respond to, that maybe somewhere down the line where my schedule opens up and I'm able to kind of spend more time in preparation. I'll try to do kind of longer form responses. But for now, if you have something, email me at revealedapologetics@gmail.com, and I'll try my best to, give the video a watch and think about it and try to offer a response if it's something worth responding to. So just want to throw that out there for folks. So again, this video here, we're going to jump right in. Debunking the tag argument for God. There's a lot. I mean, I searched debunking tag, presup destroyed, all of those phrases, and some interesting stuff pops up on YouTube. So there's like a wealth of things to respond to if someone were so inclined to spend, hours and hours and hours of scouring the YouTube for, criticisms, right? You can't respond to everybody, right? I can't respond to everybody. And even when you respond, not everyone will be persuaded by your responses. But here we are. We try our best, and hopefully, we help to a certain degree in clarifying things, and hopefully providing some useful resources for Christians who do use this methodology and want to look for ways to effectively use it in interactions with others. So I hope it's helpful to that end. Now, I forgot to mention, I will be, if anyone's interested, I'm actually speaking over in Iowa in May for an evangelism kind of equipping apologetics sort of event in Iowa. And I may be speaking in somewhere outside Nashville later on in the year. And I'll be speaking alongside Dr. James White and Dr. James Lisle, if they have been secured in terms of the invitation for them to speak. So that's going to be super exciting. I think Dr. White mentioned it on his last dividing line. So hopefully, I know he's very busy, so hopefully the schedule will work out where all three of us can be there. Since while I have spent time with Dr. White when I was recording over in Arizona at Apologia Studios, I have not had the pleasure of meeting Jason Lisle in person. So hopefully that works out, and that could happen. I think that'd be pretty cool. And so if you are looking to have a speaker at your event or a conference or do an apologetics workshop, as I say in my other videos, that's totally a thing. You can reach out to me. That's what I do when I'm not doing YouTube, when I'm not teaching full time. I am a traveling speaker, and I've traveled all around the country, giving talks on apologetics, evangelism, theology. So that's totally a thing. If you are interested, just email me at revealedapologetics@gmail.com, and on the website, right there on the homepage, there is a form you can fill out if folks are interested in that. If you are interested in simply talking, if you were like, hey, I'd really love to talk with you, Eli, for a couple of minutes, I have a question or something like that, that's totally a thing too. I've actually had people reach out to me, and we kind of just set up a private Zoom call, and you can ask me a question, or you want to, raise a point or something like that. If I have the time, I'm totally down for doing that as well. It's much easier for me to verbally communicate with people than to sit down and like write out responses to questions. So if you're a Christian and you've been doing apologetics, and you're like, hey man, this skeptic said such and such, or this objection was raised here, how would you respond to that? Reach out to me. We can totally set up a Zoom call or something like that. And it's much easier for me to kind of explain verbally than to sit down and write. I think I'm a better speaker than I am a writer. So when I write responses and it takes me a long time to do it because I'm always like, did I say that right? You want to make sure it's right. So it's much easier when someone just asks me directly and I can just give a response there. So all of those things are totally possible if that is something of interest to you. All right. Introducing All Access, your premium gateway to deeper apologetic and theological insights. Through Q&A sessions, theological lectures, and exclusive bonus content, All Access takes your learning to the next level. Support the ministry of Apologia Studios while unlocking incredible resources like Ask Me Anything, which is an interactive live stream featuring Jeff Durbin. We have the Academy featuring theological lectures from leading experts and exclusive content from shows like Apologia Radio and Cultish. With more exciting content on the way, there's never been a better time to join. Visit apologiastudios.com and click join to get started today. All right, well, without further ado, let's take a look at our first clip here. And I will try, I've only listened to this stuff like once very quickly, thought it was interesting and figured I would just offer my response here. So it's kind of raw. I don't have anything prepared. I haven't researched all of the details behind how I could answer. So I'm just kind of giving you my off-the-cuff response here. So hopefully it's still of benefit. All right, so let's take a look here. So debunking the tag argument. There we go. Boom. Let's go. Oh, nice music. Okay. Oh, is it one of those? I didn't notice it when I was. So is it one of those videos that have like the somber music while the guy's narrating? Let's see.
In this video I'm going to talk about the transcendental argument for the existence of God, and why this argument is fallacious due to an erroneous equivocation. There are many ways to argue against the tag argument, but exposing this underlying fallacy demonstrates how the end conclusion that an absolute mind, namely God, exists, simply does not follow. An example of a tag proponent committing this fallacy can be seen in the following clip.
All right, so here he, part 4, ultimate proof. So he's going to be quoting Dr. Lisle. Okay, I guess Dr. Lisle is going to be a clip of his, something that he gave, like a talk or something like that. And, pardon, I'm kind of doing something on my phone here. Let's see here. Yeah, so he's going to point out something fallacious about tag by playing this clip from Jason Lisle, and I suppose he's going to respond. So let's see here.
What are laws of logic anyway? Ever thought about that? A little bit abstract, isn't it? Can you touch a law of logic? Can you accidentally swallow one? No, because they're immaterial. They're not made up of atoms. They don't have a location in space. You can't pull a law of logic out of the refrigerator. They are universal, meaning they apply everywhere. It's not like laws of logic apply in the United States, but not in Europe. There, anything goes. Okay, there you can contradict yourself. No, they're universal. They apply everywhere. They are invariant, meaning they don't change with time. The laws of logic, it's not like they apply on Monday, but not on Fridays. They apply all the time. They're invariant, and they're abstract because they deal with concepts. So laws of logic are immaterial, universal, invariant, abstract entities which govern all possible conceptual relationships. They describe how concepts relate to each other. And if you think about it, laws of logic are contingent upon the biblical God. The biblical God can account for all of these properties. God's thoughts would necessarily be immaterial. God is an immaterial being. He's spirit. God's thoughts would be universal because God is omnipresent. His thoughts uphold the entire universe, and therefore contradictions can't happen anywhere, for example. God's thinking would be invariant because God himself does not change with time, and therefore his thoughts do not either. And they would be abstract because all thoughts are abstract. All thoughts are conceptual. So you see, the biblical God can make sense of the fact that we have laws of logic, one correct standard of reasoning that all human beings must adhere to if we're going to be rational, if we're going to come to the truth. But other worldviews cannot account for laws of logic. Take naturalism, for example. And I mentioned earlier, many evolutionists are naturalists. They believe that nature is all that there is. The naturalist attempts to use logic and reason to support his position, but there's a problem. Logic is not part of nature, right? You can't point your telescope somewhere and see a law of logic. They're not natural. And they're immaterial. So if everything that exists is part of nature, is material, then you can't have laws of logic. And so the naturalist is trying to use something that cannot exist within his own position to support his own position and to argue against Christianity. The fact that he's able to make an argument at all proves that he's wrong.
The fundamental issue with the tag argument is that its proponents erroneously fail to make a distinction between the laws of logic and what these laws refer to. Just like a photo of a car is not itself a car, or more similar, like a description of a human being is itself not a human being.
Right. So I guess I can't speak for Dr. Lisle and others, but when presuppositionalists who are arguing transcendentally will sometimes, in kind of like colloquially speaking, they'll say the laws of logic are this, that, and the other thing. I do think that there is a distinction, and I don't think when being more specific and being more technical, I don't think that presuppositionalists and proponents of tag confuse the laws of logic as a linguistic set of statements with what the laws of logic refer to. That is, obviously, it's a clear distinction. Dr. Lisle seemed to conflate the two here, but if you were to kind of corner Dr. Lisle, I'm sure he would make that distinction. So sure, yeah, if you want to be more specific, yes, there is a difference between the language we use in terms of stating the laws and the things to which the laws refer to. But let's continue. Let's hear what this gentleman has to say.
A description of X is not equal to X itself. The actual laws of logic are not what is universal, non-contingent and invariant. The laws of logic are simply descriptions of certain necessary truths, but these descriptions are not equal to what they describe, nor are these descriptions themselves non-contingent. Let's take the law of identity. A is A, something is what it is not what it is not. What you see here is nothing more than a human description, in the English language, expressed on a computer screen of a necessary truth. The actual truth the sentence represents is what is necessary and universal. The sentence itself, the actual law, is not. Now this may seem like a trivial point and an obvious point as well. However, the reason the
Well, I think it's important to recognize that propositions are truth bearers. So the proposition A is equal to A bears a truth. And the truth that it bears, I would say, is when you're talking about logical statements, are necessarily true. I'm not sure what this gentleman is trying to get at. I mean, I wonder if he thinks that the laws of logic are simply linguistic constructs that are describing reality. And so in that sense, they're not universal. All right, let's hear what he has to say the rest of the way here.
tag proponent can go from laws of logic to an absolute mind is exactly because of this erroneous equivocation. The tag proponent argues that laws of logic are conceptual by nature, they are thought, they are mental constructs, and since necessary, universal and absolute mental constructs exist, there must be a necessary, universal and absolute mind which accounts for their existence. But what is conceptual, what is thought and mental, are the descriptions, the actual laws themselves, not that which these descriptions refer to. So what do these laws describe? What is it that they refer to? The laws of logic refer to the consistency of existence. In other words, the facts regarding existing and possible entities and
Right. So the laws of logic refer to the consistency of existence, right? So yes, the laws of logic as we state them linguistically are constructs. The truths that they bear are not, you can't cast them aside. I think that the language we use to describe them are quite accurate. The question is, from an atheistic materialistic worldview, or even an atheistic immaterialistic worldview, or whatever worldview you're going to hold, when you refer to the consistency of existence, I mean, we just push the question back. Why is existence consistent? Did I say that right? Why is existence consistent? Try saying that 5 times fast. Okay, that's a fundamental question, right? This is why when we're arguing over worldviews, we're talking about the necessary preconditions for intelligibility and things like this, and various truths. We are arguing, and I keep repeating this, at the worldview level. Okay, what is the ultimate basis? What is the foundation of someone's worldview? So when you say that the laws of logic are just linguistic constructs that refer to, quote unquote, the consistency of existence, well, why is existence consistent? Or is that one of the questions we can't ask because that's following the presup script? You see how silly this can be, right? If the presup asks for these fundamental questions, then we're accused of using a script. because the person typically can't answer those questions, right? Without being arbitrary. Okay. The existence is consistent. Why? Well, because that's just the way existence is. That seems arbitrary, right? That seems also circular, right? It is because that it is. It's consistent because it's consistent, right? Let's continue.
Tag proponent argues that laws of logic are conceptual by nature, they are thought, they are mental constructs, and since necessary, universal and absolute mental constructs exist, there must be a necessary, universal and absolute mind which accounts for their existence. But what is conceptual, what is thought and mental, are the descriptions, the actual laws themselves, not that which these descriptions refer to. So what do these laws describe? What is it that they refer to? The laws of logic refer to the consistency of existence, in other words, the facts regarding existing and possible entities and the behavior of and relationships between those entities. So the law of identity is a description of the fact of identity, a description of the fact that an entity is itself.
Why is that the case? Again, we need to press for consistency here. Why is a fact what it is, and why does it maintain consistency? Okay, why is reality consistent? Okay, if you posit that reality is consistent is something that is a brute given, okay, it just is that way, then it's arbitrary, right? It's arbitrary. That's just, and that's the definition of a brute fact, right? A brute fact is something that just is the case. Okay. As a foundation of a worldview, that's not going to get you anywhere, especially when someone comes along and disagrees with your brute fact. What if someone comes along and says, well, I don't believe in brute facts, and here's why? How do you make the distinction between the two positions? You see, as a matter of fact, coincidentally, as a presuppositionalist and as a biblical Christian, I reject the existence of brute facts. So where do we go from there, right? The universe just is that way. Okay, God is just that way. You see, so there you go. You start with an arbitrary foundation. I'll just assert my foundation as being the case. That's just the way that it is. Okay. So that doesn't really answer the question, and it kind of sneaks in kind of this assumption of brute factuality, which presuppositionalists would reject. Okay. Now, before you kind of, throw something at the screen, you'd be like, well, Eli, what about your God thing, right? Isn't God a brute fact, okay, in your own system? And the answer to that is clearly no. Within Christian theology, God is not a brute fact. A brute fact, philosophically understood, is a fact that has no explanation, either external or internally, okay? The brute fact in question has no external explanation. Its existence is not dependent upon something external to itself. And a brute fact has no internal explanation, internally considering the nature of the thing, it just is. From within the Christian perspective, God is not a brute fact because while he does lack an external explanation, right, given the doctrine of aseity, the idea that God is self-existent, he does not depend on anything external to himself, God does in fact have an internal explanation. Namely, the internal explanation for God is that he exists out of a necessity of his own nature, okay? These, by the way, are two ways that a thing can exist, right? Something can exist because it depends on something external to itself for its existence, or something can exist because it exists out of a necessity of its own nature, okay? If you have an external explanation, you exist because something external to yourself, or you have an internal explanation, it exists out of a necessity of its own nature, then you have an explanation for the existence of the thing in question, which by definition would make it not a brute fact. A brute fact just is, and that's all, okay? Again, if you're going to assert that the consistency of reality just is, then if that's a brute given, then it's arbitrary. How do you argue against the person who challenges your particular chosen brute fact? Okay, so you need to go deeper than this. This is why we talk about worldviews. That's why we argue the Christian system. Okay, the consistency of creation is what it is because God imposes consistency upon what he creates, because God himself is consistent. So the consistency from a Christian perspective that is exemplified in the universe is imposed upon it by the one who created, defined, and governs the relationships between the various things within creation. Okay? You might not accept that. You might not like that. You might disagree, but that is not arbitrary. Whereas the position, well, it's just consistent, and that's because. And don't ask why it's consistent. That's a stupid question, right? This is what we'll be told, right? This is a silly question. It's a trap question, or nobody knows how to answer those questions, or these sorts of things. Obviously, when someone waves their hand and says you're not allowed to answer those questions, or if someone says, well, that's just that's just your presup script, waving your hand doesn't actually demonstrate your point. Let's continue.
Now let's imagine a world in which nothing but a circle exists. There are no other entities apart from this circle. Since there are no minds in this world, the law of identity cannot exist, since there is nothing to think about any sort of description. But the fact of identity is still true. The circle is a circle. There is just simply nothing that can recognize this fact and describe it as such. However, if a mind would exist as well, then it is possible for there to be such a description as well. But the fact of identity doesn't depend on the existence of a mind per se. It depends on the existence of anything at all.
Can a circle be a square if there are no minds to perceive it? Right? In other words, what prevents a circle from being its opposite? Right? Well, it's consistency, bro. That's just the way reality is, right?
And all the necessity of these facts demonstrate is the necessity of reality itself. There cannot be...
And what is the nature of reality? Is reality by necessity consistent? Again, these are foundational questions. Why is reality not all sound and fury signifying nothing? Right? Isn't that possible? All right. If it's not possible, then how do you justify that it's impossible? Right? These are the fundamental questions that when we're pushing for the skeptic, the atheist, the whoever's holding this position, we're asking those fundamental questions. And of course, we're often told that we can't ask those questions, right? But that's the question we need to be asking. This is where we need to be pushing, right? If you are going to reject the Christian worldview, then you're going to have to answer those questions from within your Christian if you're going to reject the Christian worldview, you're going to have to answer those fundamental questions from within your non-Christian worldview, right? We're not going to just grant you these brute givens, okay? And it's not a tactic per se. It's not something that we're trying to trick you. It's, as a Christian, at least for I know that there are Christians who might hold to brute factual. I think that they would be inconsistent with biblical teaching, but nevertheless, I'm not going to grant you brute factuality because I reject brute factuality. My worldview does not allow me to affirm a brute fact. Okay, as Van Til said, a brute fact is a mute fact. I believe that facts must be interpreted within a particular worldview perspective. All right.
No reality at all. There are always facts, and since facts are about something, something necessarily has to exist. But it cannot in of itself demonstrate anything about the nature of what exists, nor what lies at the very foundation of reality.
Right, so you don't know the nature of what exists. For all you know, what exists is chaos, in which contradictions can be true, where things can be the opposites of themselves, right? And this is what happens when you start with something abstract. You'll have some atheists say, well, the fundamental truth of reality is that reality just exists. Reality is reality, whatever that means, right? You want to be very careful with statements like reality is real. I have a whole video on this, by the way. I think it's called Reality is Reality or something like that. When someone states reality is reality, I want you to take note of this. That is the most ambiguous set of words ever. What is reality? Move me beyond the words you're using, reality, and what is the referent? What is it's existence. Well, what is the nature of existence on your view? See, from the Christian perspective, we believe we can know the nature of reality. We don't know nature exhaustive. I'm not omniscient, but if there is a God who created all things and he reveals things to us, we can know certain things about reality. We can know that reality is everything other than God. Reality is created, right? We can know something about the world, okay? How do you know that, right? When you state reality is reality, that doesn't really tell me anything. It's just so vague and ambiguous. Dr. Greg Bahnsen was a renowned Christian apologist, philosopher, and seminary professor, and his life's work is now at your fingertips with Bahnsen U. Bahnsen U aims to bring seminary-level education to every Christian anytime, anywhere, absolutely free. Gain access to over 140 courses covering theology, apologetics, eschatology, and law, featuring sermons, seminary lectures, and more from the legendary Dr. Greg Bahnsen. Now, if you sign up today at apologiastudios.com and join over 13,000 users already benefiting from this incredible resource, you will not regret it. And soon, they're expanding with Bahnsen U Plus and Bahnsen U Live, bringing fresh supplemental learning and real-time engagement. Again, go to apologiastudios.com and start your journey today. So we're going to move into another part of this video where another gentleman comes and shares his issues with tag. So before I do that, so does this debunk tag? No, it does not debunk tag. There is nothing intrinsic within the transcendental argument or proponents who use this where they fail to make, or is an essential feature to the argument to not make the proper distinction between the linguistic set of laws that we speak, law of identity, law of excluded middle, law of non-contradiction, and the things that they refer to. We're very well aware that there is a distinction there, although granted, sometimes when talking about them, we will talk about the laws of logic in that general sense, and it won't be as precise as it needs to be, and I get that too. But that's not something intrinsic to the transcendental argumentation and the presuppositional methodology. All right?
Okay, well, that makes sense. Okay, well,
and I can't. So the next thing that logically we should talk about is a.
Now, I don't know who this person is. I forgot. Maybe his name is Scott something or other. I don't remember. Apparently, years back, he argued with or debated with Matt Slick on the transcendental argument. And so I think that's maybe the context. Maybe he's responding to Matt Slick or whatever. Let's see what he says.
To talk about is logic. Isn't that convenient? There's two things going on when it comes to logic, and a lot of people I notice make the mistake of treating them like they're the same thing, or at least confusing one thing with the other. Logic serves two different purposes. One is descriptive, and the other is prescriptive. Logic is descriptive of the universe, of existence. It's a representation of the way existence and all things that exist behave. It's a model of reality. It's descriptive, okay? Logic is also prescriptive for human beings. It instructs us on how to think and how to process in a way that matches reality. It prescribes principles to us so that we can govern our reasoning, so that we can arrive at more solid, better conclusions. The danger is when, whether we know it or not, we treat logic as if it's prescriptive for the universe or reality or existence, and it's not. The universe doesn't need a prescription for how to behave. It behaves the way it behaves.
It just is what it is. It just behaves the way it behaves. Again, the sneaking in of brute factuality, which is something, if I'm talking to my fellow presuppers here, something you're going to want to address.
You take the law of non-contradiction or the law of identity, and a lot of people think that it means that existence is being governed by laws, as if it were being.
From within a Christian perspective, the universe is governed by the consistency that God imposes upon it, that is a reflection of his nature. Again, that's not arbitrary because there's an explanation as to why the universe is consistent. Okay, we're not stating the consistency of the universe as a brute fact. Remember, I said before, we reject brute factuality, where I think these gentlemen, the first video and this gentleman here, seems to be assuming here. But then again, I don't know this person's views, so it would be interesting to hear what he would have to say, but nevertheless.
Told what to do. Not really. That's just an anthropomorphic expression we use. The behavior of existence isn't informed by logic. It informs logic, and logic in turn informs.
Again, that assumes that the reality, that existence has this consistency, but then we ask the question, why? As we asked before, why does reality display the consistency that it does? Right? And what answer are we going to get? Well, it's just the way it is. Okay, cool. God exists. That's just the way it is. You see how that doesn't work? Doesn't go deep enough?
Informs us. If anything, the law of non-contradiction is a law for us to help govern our thinking. Here's the thing about existence. Existence behaves consistently with itself.
Why? Oh, I'm sorry. Not allowed to ask that question.
It just does. Things.
It just does. That's it. It acts consistently because it's just the way that it is. It's a silly thing. That's just the way that it is, man. Right? And if Christian argued this way, then of course, the Christian would be laughed out of the room, right? Existence acts the way that it is just because that's the way it is, right? Again, so from a Christian perspective, I'm talking to my Christians here. when someone asserts something arbitrary like that, then you reverse the role. Okay. The Bible is true because, that's just the way it is, right? Things just are the way they are. The Bible is true. God exists. You just can't make sense out of anything without those things being true. Well, but how do you know it's true? That's just the way it is, man. It's just so silly. You shouldn't even be asking the question. You see how silly it is, right? The skeptics want us to take for granted their assumptions, right? But of course, they won't take your assumptions for granted, right? Because why? Because nobody's neutral, right? The idea that the universe and reality is something that is consistent is itself not a neutral fact. So then we ask the deeper question, why is reality consistent in the way that we observe it, and then hence create language to describe it, right? These are the deeper questions that you need to ask. And don't be bullied by people say, well, those are just silly questions, right? Philosophers don't ask those questions. By the way, they do. But regardless, it's still a good question to ask.
That exist reliably behave in a certain way, and they just don't behave another way. This is true of any philosophy, any worldview. You go back far enough, and there's going to be a set of basic preconditions to existence that just behave the way that they do. As human beings, we've observed this. We're able to make accurate predictions based on this, and we've created a language for ourselves of symbols and structures that act as a representation of what we observe about the universe. Now there's a couple of objections that I can imagine you making at this point. Both would demonstrate a profound misunderstanding of my position, but why not? Let me just check in here. Now, I could see you, for one, doing maybe a premature victory dance because you heard me acknowledge that logic is man-made, right? And you're getting ready to give me the whole spiel about how anything man-made is subjective because human minds think differently and so on and so forth. Now, the last thing I want to do is underestimate you, but if you are going down that road, if you are thinking that, then you miss the point and you're not paying attention. Logic is man-made in either worldview. We're talking about the language, the process that we've created.
Right. So the language we use to describe reality is, obviously we're developing the language to describe it. But I do think that the language we use is describing reality that is functioning in a consistent fashion. But the Christian worldview has a reason why reality is consistent, such that the language we use to describe it makes sense in the first place, right? What is your non-arbitrary justification for why reality is consistent, and hence the language we use to describe it is useful? That's the question.
Consistency of existence, however, that logic was created to represent is not man-made. Existence behaves the way that it does independently of our consciousness or our perceptions, and it's thus not subjective. It is outside of ourselves. We can all observe it. We can all see the same thing. It's not just our opinion. Now, another thing you might be thinking on, riding the coattails of that is that observation isn't good enough, right? You might try and argue that since we are subjective beings, we can only observe the universe from one tiny little perspective and therefore aren't in a position of claiming that logical absolutes are in fact absolute.
Well, that is true. If you hold to like an empirical view, knowledge comes by observation, experience, and so forth, then you cannot observe, if that's the way knowledge is gained, you cannot observe the universality of a law, right? You just can't. Let's see what he says here.
How would we know, right? Simply observing the universe and the consistency of existence doesn't justify us in putting stock in the law of non-contradiction, for example, because
that is correct.
You'd need infinite knowledge in order to falsify it. And that's true.
And that's true. He acknowledges it. But let's see what he says to qualify it.
It's totally true. But if you think that's a legitimate objection to my worldview and not yours at the same time, then you're still missing the point. Because even if we assume the truth of Christianity, we're still in the same boat. Because remember, Matt, your worldview doesn't equip you to demonstrate that the law of non-contradiction, for example, is true. You can try and make the claim that logical absolutes can be accounted for by positing a God, but nothing about Christianity aids you in proving that the law of non-contradiction is one of those absolutes.
Wait. So is he saying that the Christian worldview does not provide a basis for knowing that the law of non-contradiction holds? Yeah, we do. Given the biblical revelation, there's, let me see here. Let's test this hypothesis. Okay. Let's see here. So let's see what he said. Let me rewind it back. Let me see. I don't want to go too far back. Where am I? What timestamp am I at? Let's go back here. Okay, I apologize if I go back too far. Let's see.
You'd need infinite knowledge in order to falsify it. And that's true. That's totally true. But if you think that's a legitimate objection to my worldview and not yours at the same time, then you're still missing the point. Because even if we assume the truth of Christianity, we're still in the same boat. Because remember, Matt, your worldview doesn't equip you to demonstrate that the law of non-contradiction, for example, is true. You can try and make the claim that logical absolutes can be accounted for by positing a God, but nothing about Christianity aids you in proving that the law of non-contradiction is one of those absolutes. Nothing in Scripture says that something can't be both A and not A at the same time. Nothing in the...
Sure it does. That's demonstrably false. Now, given the nature of Scripture within the Christian worldview, we take it as the Word of God. It comes with self-attesting authority. If you're a non-Christian, you don't have to accept that. But thinking in terms of consistency as a Christian, it comes with self-attesting authority. So we argue that the biblical worldview provides the metaphysical foundation, epistemological foundation for knowledge and logic and so on and so forth. And yes, it is entirely biblical to say that contradictions cannot be true. I mean, 2 Timothy 2:13, I have it here. So if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. And this explicitly states that God cannot contradict himself. If God is truth, John 14:6, which he is, he cannot affirm both truth and falsehood simultaneously. Titus 1:2, in hope of eternal life, which God, who never lies, promised before the ages began. So if God cannot lie, he never lies, then truth and falsehood cannot coexist in the same way at the same time. All right. I mean, this is straight out of the pages of Scripture. Obviously, the Bible doesn't use the laws of logic in terms of stating it the way that we do. But the idea that something can be true and false at the same time and in the same way is not something that the Bible has nothing to say about. Right. His word is not yes and no. That's what the Bible says. Right. God does not contradict himself. Okay. Now, maybe you think, well, the Bible's filled with contradictions, blah, blah. I'm talking about from within a Christian worldview. Okay, there is a basis from within the system to reject the possibility of contradictions. Now, again, you don't have to accept the biblical worldview, but this is blatantly false, right? Let's listen to it again real quick. What does he say here? I'm going to go back just a little bit. Sorry.
Are in fact absolute. How would we know, right? Simply observing the universe and the consistency of existence doesn't justify us in putting stock in the law of non-contradiction, for example, because you'd need infinite knowledge in order to falsify it.
Right. So just rewinding there. So yes, if you are basing if your epistemology is grounded in like empirical observation, then yes, you cannot empirically observe the law. You cannot empirically observe a logical principle or a universal truth or something along those lines.
And that's true. That's totally true. But if you think that's a legitimate objection
See, so he agrees, but he thinks that the Christian has the same problem, because there's nothing inherent within the Christian worldview that says otherwise.
My worldview and not yours at the same time, then you're still missing the point. Because even if we assume the truth of Christianity, we're still in the same boat. Because remember, Matt, your worldview doesn't equip you to demonstrate that the law of non-contradiction, for example.
So if you assume that the Christian worldview is true, hypothetically, then yes, the Christian worldview does equip us for the very thing he says it doesn't equip us for.
Is true. You can try and make the claim that logical absolutes can be accounted for by positing a God, but nothing about Christianity aids you in proving that the law of non-contradiction is one of those absolutes.
Incorrect, which we just demonstrated.
Nothing in Scripture says that something can't be both A and not A at the same time. Nothing in the physical universe you believe God created verifies the law of non-contradiction.
Again, I hope you could see that this is a perfect example of an external critique. This is what happens when people critique the Christian worldview, but are not fully acquainted with what the Christian worldview actually asserts. Okay. And so just if I can talk to my fellow Christians here, you always want to look for these kinds of misrepresentations. By the way, I'm not saying that this individual is doing this on purpose, right? When someone misrepresents the Christian view, when they say, well, but if you say this, then what about that? Even if we grant your Christian worldview, then you have the same problem. Not everyone who says that is doing it out of like malicious, like I'm trying to be deceptive. It requires you as the Christian to correct your interlocutor and educate them on what the Christian worldview actually asserts. okay? Because a lot of the criticisms of tag and criticisms of or attempted internal critiques of the Christian worldview are predicated upon misunderstandings of the Christian worldview. Pardon. And so you're going to need to be able to do that. This is why I've said in other contexts that when we engage in worldview analysis, when we engage in internal critique of another person's worldview, right? And then they engage in internal critique of our worldview, I always encourage people that the key to surviving the attempted internal critique of your own worldview is to simply know your worldview, you see. Because in knowing your worldview, you will be able to easily identify misrepresentations of your worldview disguised as a valid internal critique of your worldview. Okay, I'm going to say that again. This is so key, right? The key to surviving an internal critique of your worldview is to know your worldview well so that you can recognize misrepresentations of your worldview disguised as a valid critique, internal critique of your worldview. And this is a perfect example, okay? And this could be multiplied. Anytime someone says, well, let's grant Jesus rose from the dead. That doesn't prove that God exists. That, he could have been raised he could have been raised by some other God other than Yahweh. Well, within the Christian worldview, that's not possible. If you hypothetically grant the Christian worldview, then that example that's used is literally impossible given the truth of the Christian worldview, which at least this individual says, let's grant that it's true. I mean, that's what he says. Let's go back here. He says, let's grant that it's true. Ready? Watch this.
And not yours at the same time, then you're still missing the point. Because even if we assume the truth of Christianity, which means you're assuming the truth of the whole ball of wax, okay? We're still in the same boat. Because remember, Matt, your worldview doesn't equip you to demonstrate that the law of non-contradiction, for example, is true.
False. That's false.
You can try and make the claim that logical absolutes can be accounted for by positing a God, but
they can.
Nothing about Christianity aids you in proving that the law of non-contradiction is one of those.
And that's false. So again, as Christians, we're not empiricists. I mean, we're not saying all knowledge comes through observation. I mean, obviously, from the Christian perspective, the very basis of our epistemology is revelation, right? The reason why I could know things that I have not completely and fully observed all instances is because my knowledge of those things is rooted in the revelation of God. It's rooted in the revelation of the one who does know all things. Now, granted, you're a skeptic watching this video. You're not going to buy that. I get it, right? That's totally makes sense. I don't believe that. But from within a Christian worldview, it makes perfect sense for me to claim to at least know certain things that I did not fully observe myself, because our knowledge is rooted in revelation. It is not rooted in mere observation. I say mere observation because obviously I do believe that we observe and we can come to knowledge through observation, but it's never independent of divine revelation, never independent of a coherent worldview that makes sense as to why I should trust the general reliability of my sense experience. Okay, so all of these things need to be taken in consideration, and that's why I'm going to keep harping this. What Van Til said is that we do not defend the Christian worldview in a piecemeal fashion. We don't isolate parts of our worldview and talk about them independent of the entire system. You see, it's the entire system of Christian theism that provides a meaningful context for why we understand the specifics, a specific item within our worldview in the particular way that we do, okay? So you always want to understand that worldview context, all right? And so again, and at the same time, recognize kind of these straw man misrepresentations, all right?
Absolutes. Nothing in Scripture says that something can't be both A and not A at the same time. Nothing in the physical universe you believe God created verifies the law of non-contradiction. It's still a tautology, and it still has to assume its own truth in order to work. That's one of the lies.
Yes, you do assume the truth of the foundation. If you're dealing with necessary preconditions, you do by definition. If you're dealing with necessary preconditions, you have to assume it even when trying to validate it. But of course, how do we validate those presuppositions? Okay, if my presupposition as a Christian is that the Christian God, the ontological Trinity, and his revelation are the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience and logic and knowledge and so forth, how do we justify that? Well, we justify it through a transcendental argument. That's how you justify a presupposition. Again, don't let people hand wave to, by definition, presuppositions can't be justified. That's false. That's false. We are justifying our presupposition via a transcendental argument. right? So don't let them confuse. Sometimes people confuse a presupposition with an axiom. And so those terms need to be understood within their proper context, okay?
Abilities of using logic. This is true of any and all logical principles, including the law of identity and the law of excluded middle, two other favorites of yours I've noticed. When it comes to identifying logical absolutes, you're in no better of a position than I am, and you as well have to rely on mere subjective observation. The best you can do is maintain that logical absolutes exist and that God is their source, but it wouldn't put you any closer to knowing.
See, so this is, again, I'll stop it here. This is the problem that I see, is that when the Christian, and I'm not saying that Matt Slick did this successfully. I don't remember. I watched this video. Well, it wasn't this. I guess he's responding. Maybe he's responding to Matt Slick as a compilation, so I don't know the original video. But I know Matt Slick had a discussion with him years and years ago. And I watched the full discussion a long time ago, so I don't remember the context or whatever. But what I see is that when the skeptic is pressed on these kind of deep, profound epistemological issues, like how we know, how we justify, they will often try to reverse and say, well, I have this problem, but you have this problem too, as though our worldview has the same deficiencies as the skeptic's worldview, and they don't. Okay. It is the skeptic that is stuck in what philosophers call the egocentric predicament. Okay. The Christian isn't stuck in that. Okay. Because our worldview isn't that. We don't start with ourselves. We start with God and his revelation. Okay. Now, of course, I did explain that there is a sense in which we need to understand the phrase start with. Chronologically, I start with my mind and my reasoning. But logically, I start with God and his revelation as the necessary precondition for the very intelligibility of my reasoning to begin with. So that's another issue. When someone brings up, you can't start with yourself. You can't start with God. You have to start with yourself. Actually, when someone says you either start with God or yourself, that's a false dichotomy. We start with both simultaneously. I start with myself chronologically speaking, but logically speaking, I start with God. Okay, there are different orders in which one can start with something. Got a whole video on that, explaining that in detail. I'm kind of hand waving it real quick because I don't want to repeat myself. But there you go. You want to be very careful when someone says, well, I have this problem, but you have this problem too, as though we hold to the same kind of foundations as they do. Okay. You want to identify when people's like, well, you have this problem too, why should we trust the general reliability of our senses? Well, on atheism, okay, if you believe that we are a product of a blind evolutionary process, well, the things that we accrued through the evolutionary development of man was for the purpose of survival, okay? And survival doesn't necessarily get you at truth. Okay, but from the Christian perspective, my senses were created to be generally reliable, to ascertain various truths about the world that God has created. That was the purpose for which they were created. Okay, and now there's more to that. Okay, people can bring kind of the skeptical challenge, but how do you know? How do you know? How do you know? And that's where the transcendental argument ultimately kind of comes into service, because historically, what has been the purpose of transcendental arguments? Well, they are understood as anti-skeptical arguments. I mean, they're equipped to answer those very hypothetical skeptical scenarios that the atheist might bring up. Well, you don't know because what about, how do you know you're not a brain in a vat? These transcendental arguments are meant to respond to those very kinds of arguments. And so you want to be very careful when someone just tries to turn it around and say, I have a problem in my perspective, but so do you. Okay. All right. Well, that is it for this video. That's as much time as I have. Unfortunately, I do have to sign off and spend some time with the family. And I also have lesson plans I have to do. It's Sunday, so tomorrow's Monday, so I got to get that work done. But I hope that this is helpful. I do talk really fast, so I do apologize if that was hard to follow along with. But I hope that as you are trying to learn presuppositional apologetics, transcendental arguments, these sorts of things, I hope that this helps you in teaching you what to look for when someone does put forth objections against the Christian worldview. First, you want to make a distinction. There's a couple of distinctions I want you to keep in mind. I say this in a lot of videos. I'm going to say it here. You want to make a distinction between presuppositionalism as a methodology and transcendental argumentation, and presuppositionalists, how certain individuals argue. So you see what I'm saying? So you could have a presuppositionalist argue in a certain way, but that's not essential to like the methodology as a whole or the transcendental argument specifically speaking. That's number one. Number two, you want to challenge fundamental assumptions, right? The laws of logic are linguistic constructs that we use to describe reality, okay? It describes the consistency of reality, okay? Challenge that fundamental assumption. Well, why is reality consistent? Well, it's just that way. And how is that not arbitrary? Well, it's just that way. Obviously, it is like, don't you believe that? Well, yeah, I believe that reality is consistent because I have a justification for that as a Christian. But why do you have, what is your justification for that? Don't be bullied into that's a silly question or you shouldn't ask those questions. Challenge and push on those pressure points. As a matter of fact, when someone hand waves you and says, that's a silly question, chances are, I mean, they might be correct when you ask a stupid question. They might be correct and be like, that's a stupid question. But in this case, if someone says, oh, that's just a silly question, you probably uncovered a weak point, which you want to continue to pursue. Okay, so you want to be very careful with that. Also, you want to be very careful of straw men, right? So I'll repeat this part again just to summarize. One of the key ways that you survive an internal critique of the Christian worldview is simply to know the Christian worldview well, so that you could identify misrepresentations of the Christian worldview, as I said before, disguised as an internal critique of your Christian worldview. Okay, this happened with in my debate/discussion with the atheist Eric Murphy, where he once he finally understood what I was referring to with respect to internal critiques of worldviews, he tried to offer an internal critique by trying to show that the concept of the Trinity was illogical. And of course, the explanation that he gave of the Trinity wasn't what Christians believe about the Trinity. And so it required my explanation of what the Trinity is to cast aside the faulty misrepresentation. See, that's not some, secret tactic. That's just correcting someone and their misunderstanding of your worldview, because you cannot internally critique a worldview when you're misrepresenting the worldview. Because remember, an internal critique hypothetically grants the truth of the worldview in question and shows on its own ground that there are problems, okay? But once people start imposing things in that internal critique that is alien to the Christian worldview, you need to say, excuse me, given the truth of the Christian worldview, hypothetically speaking, that's impossible, or that's not the case. You need to be able to point those out, and that requires you to know your worldview, all right? Well, folks, I hope this is helpful. Again, once I said, as I said in the beginning, if you have something that you want me to respond to specifically, just make sure it is manageable for me, just due to time constraints. Maybe something 20 minutes or under, maybe 25 minutes, maybe I'll respond to something like that. I mean, some of this stuff requires a lot of work and preparation, which I don't mind, but I just don't always have the time for. But if you have something you want me to respond to, please send it in to revealedapologetics@gmail.com. I will definitely give it a watch or a listen and see if I'm able to respond to it. If you happen to send me something that I'm unable to respond to, I know people, right? I know people, okay? As the mobsters say, I know a guy, right? I know people who are far smarter than myself that can help me. So just because you send me something that I'm unable to respond to, I'll try my best to find someone who is able to respond, and we'll have them hop on the show and try to address those issues. My goal here is to provide Christians with resources and defenses of the Christian faith that address all of these objections that come and go on the internet and face-to-face interactions and debates and so forth. And so I don't mind helping in that regard. I try my best to be a resource to folks in that way. All right. Well, I guess that's it. That's it for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for listening in. Until next time, take care and God bless. Bye-bye.